Wesley Page, 164 pounds, 5 foot 11 inches, single, not on medication. Fine to serve. Please follow along the white line to the infirmary to receive your uniform. Next. And those sentences were enough to wake him up from that awful nightmare. Ever since that summer, when he was just 11, his greatest fear has been getting drafted into the army, and peanut butter, because when he was just 6, he climbed atop the kitchen counter, spread some of it on his legs, then walked around like that until one of the dogs in the neighborhood tried to take a bite out of him. When his father told him the stories about Wesley's grandpa, how he fought in the First World War, how he was stationed near the borders of Germany, and how he had to use his rifle to kill others that were just like him, but with a different country to their names, he quickly realized that the only thing he could never be was a soldier. Not like he had dreamt of being one, like he did with firefighters, policemen or train conductors, but he always thought there must be some respect earned by being a soldier especially. Whenever they would walk around town, they would see discharged veterans pass by constantly, and almost everyone saluted them and thanked them for their service. But after those tales about his grandfather, Wesley never did think that again. In fact, he dumped his whole set of clay soldiers in the bin, with the scene still set, a wounded mercenary crawling backwards as another one defends him in front. Throughout his teenage years he despised violence and all games that had anything to do with weapons. Whenever his friends would play tag, he would rather sit out, than be chased by somebody else. But sooner or later he had to realize that life, in one form or another, always contained some violence in every situation. Maybe not one's own violence, maybe frustrations and feelings that were carried through from a background, an environment, that come to the surface and show themselves for who they really are. Anyhow, he knew that he had to get as far away from it as possible. As the years turned over and the world took many trips, and he himself shook many hands and looked into more than many eyes, his fear was increasingly becoming a paranoia, rather than something that stuck in the back of his head from his later days of childhood. He finally moved out and got himself his own place to live in. He was working as a caretaker in a daycare near the outskirts of the city, making a livable wage and taking care of himself. This lasted approximately 1 year, because when the newsletter arrived on his front porch during a hot and humid Wednesday morning, the headlines were talking about a civil war and unrest in a neighboring country. Now he could have just ignored it, or prayed that it would be over soon, for those involved, but because of the very thing that was in the back of his head, stuck there for almost a decade, he thought about it. And he leaned against the frame of the front door, with the morning paper in his hands, and thought about it. I mean, it's not here. But it could be. What if it escalates? Maybe it solves itself in a couple of weeks. But if it doesn't, and they come through the borders too? I live nearby, I don't have anything to protect myself with. So with those thoughts in his head, and some more, that he came up with during that day, the next morning he walked into the gunsmith and bought himself a shotgun. Just in case, Wesley said to himself. Every single day that followed that purchase made the whole situation worse. First, he had a gun now. How would my 14-year-old self feel about this? He thought. Secondly, he started to shut his windows throughout the night. He didn't do that before, because he has fences, animals can't come in, neither people, so why not let some of the cool air in anyway? Originally, he intended to keep his gun below his bed, and that did happen for a day or two, but eventually he put it on the bedside table. Then on the dining table, and by the time he had it with him at all times, his windows were blocked by pieces of wood nailed to them in a way that only a couple of lucky beams of light were able to illuminate his room. The door was barricaded, and the fireplace was put out, in case they come, they can't hear that someone is in the house. His shirt was drenched in sweat and he himself was drowning in insomnia, as he hadn't slept anything in the past couple of days. As a sunrise followed after a sunset before, during the last dawn of August, he was squatting with his back to the door. With his gun in his hand, he looked around, trying to find where the footsteps were coming from. The cacophony of mines going off in the distance mixed with the quiet droning of bombing planes filled the sky as he frantically searched for a hole in the walls they could drop their grenades through. The sound of someone knocking on his door behind him came like a thunder after lightning. The Germans. They are coming. There is another big war happening. Hitler is coming. He screamed out towards the door. At that moment someone slipped the morning papers below the cracks where they barely fit through, and as Wesley Page jumped up, thinking it's a bomb, realized it's the papers, he stood up, took the papers into one of his hands, saw the front page, and with his shotgun cocked in the other arm, he put it against his head and shot himself. The newspaper fell onto the floor with its headline in big bold letters, "Barefoot Ethiopian wins 1960 Olympics."